To the family and friends of the late Professor George Kanyeihamba, Professor George Kanyeihamba comes from a stock of honest men and women whose asset is their forthrightness in dealing with public issues, their sense of candor in managing relationships, and their brilliance in debate about what a country or an institution needs. They may be disagreeable, but they do their work and they speak with conviction. Sadly, many are leaving us today because they were born when Uganda was still a colony. And as you can see, Professor Kanyeihamba was born at the start of the Second World War. These people took early education when few people went to school and they excelled. They served the early unstable governments of Uganda in the 1970s and 1980s, and they brought the movement government into the knowledge and acceptability by both domestic and international audiences. At the time, very few knew about NRM and its leaders, and even a substantial global opinion used to call NRM leaders communists. This cohort of our leaders, represented by Kanyeihamba, are now dying, and they are buried in their country of birth, not in exile, and this is something to thank God for as a country. Professor Kanyeihamba was very sincere when he disagreed with you, and he told you what he felt and thought about you. It was you to convince him otherwise by the force of both your character and ideas. Many people will instead speak ill about you in the dark, and they smile when they meet you. He was different. I remember when he was head of the Legal and Drafting Committee in the Constituent Assembly, he disagreed vehemently with my evening summary reports of the sessions to the media. He came to my editor to protest, asking my editor to either substitute me with another person or to restrain my writing, which he, Professor Kanyeihamba, thought was more opinionated than actual. I listened to Professor Kanyeihamba when I was told he had held strong opinions about my work, and out of this we became good friends. Years later, when we settled in the same neighborhood in Obuziga, he called me about a young man who had done a shoddy job for me and who had run away from work that I had given him. He insisted, Professor Kanyeihamba insisted, I must pay the young man even if his work wasn't pleasing. I listened again and did what Professor Kanyeihamba asked me to do. That tells you he worked with people of lower means as well as high status, freely, equally, and joyfully. I suppose this is also why in 1988, when I was a young man in high school, he came to our small village of Byazo in Kenshunga of Chiruhura as minister of government to arbitrate in a family conflict of my late grandparents. He would have sent a junior officer, but he stepped forward himself. I will miss this spirit of public service, which exhibits to us a sense of humility and availability to the common person. Even when church began in our home next to his house in Uziga, he encouraged and wrote to my wife to keep preaching the word of God, and he even came to church in our home. Professor Kanyeihamba also loved nature and culture in spite of his busy schedule of writing, of teaching, of politics, and public service. He once told me that the reason he loved and stayed in Wales in exile was the rolling hills in the middle of that part of the United Kingdom. For that part of the UK reminded him of Kabale Hills where he grew up. Indeed, when I first took a train from Paddington in London to Cardiff in the spring of 1996 as a student, I saw with my eyes these beautifully shaped rolling hills with sheep and cattle grazing in the grassland. I later visited the Brecon Beacons, those rounded, high, rolling terrain in South Wales, which confirmed fully why Mzee Kanyeihamba had fallen in love with this country and its people. He was the only person who came to my university and took me out for a meal. I will miss him and his sense of generosity. You never forget these moments later in life. Culturally, he was also well rooted in his people and his soil. I found out recently that he came from the sub-clan of the Abagabira, who have the same mother as Abazigaba, Abasakuru, and Abanyangabo. Now, for any young people who might not know our country's history, these clans I mentioned are connected to the greater Ankole, Rujumbura, Mpororo, Bunyoro, Toro, and even in parts of Buganda. These clans specifically produced John Bukangaga. John Bukangaga was Omsakuru from Buchimbiri. Buchimbiri is now, I think, in Kisoro. Bukangaga was the leader, or what the Banyachigezi called Urtachirwa of Chigezi from 1963. I have also not checked, but I suspect that Paulo or Petero Ngorogoza of the Bainika clan, his praise name was Rugusha Rwanyinababiri, who led Uganda to independence negotiations in the UK in 1961. This Ngorogoza was also a native chief administrator of Chigezi. He might also belong to the same roots as Kanyeihamba. Ngorogoza worked very closely with Ankole leaders like Mzee Mungonya to settle many Bachiga in Mwizi area of Rwampara from 1947. This same grouping, I think, also produces our current Dr. Muranga, the scientist and husband to my sister in the Lord, Dr. Florence Muranga, of the Toke product. Toke is now doing very well in Uganda, parts of DRC, and now in the US. Now do you young people see how connected through Kanyeihamba and his roots we are as a people? Those of you who want to separate us with tribal and religious talk of yesterday, you will fail. You should be careful, because all our 65 nations, the ones you like to call tribes, I call them nations of Uganda, we are now more interconnected today than you think. Finally, I thank President Yoweri Museveni for allowing us to honor Mzee Kanyeihamba last year in 2024 with the National Leadership and Mentorship Award. To honor this old man in front of hundreds of youth leaders, leaders of universities, leaders at a national level, and elders, all at a national level, gave me great joy. And I'm honored that we were a small part of Kanyeihamba's life in this respect. Now, to you young people listening to me, there is no loss in honoring the elders. A Stanford University experiment, Stanford in the US, they did an experiment some time back on regenerative medicine. That experiment showed that if you pair an old organism with a young one and you connect their circulatory systems, their breathing, their blood flow systems, the old organism regains muscles, it regains bone strength, it even gains better breathing, while the young one, although it ages, it's not at a terrible rate. It tells you that both organisms gain some time in their lives by working together. In social terms, it means we learn better when we pair ourselves with the older groups so we can see what they went through, how they made decisions to build a country, while at the same time we re-energize them, those older people, with better, fresher, newer knowledge that they may not have. That is how I work, and that is what we call mentorship, to sustain a country's growing institutions and push out bad elements who want to reverse our gains in democracy, in our economy, and broadly in our society. Therefore, we need more Kanyeihambas in the public service, in parliament, in institutions, to keep reminding us to stay the course and not to be diverted, and to tell us without fear or favor. The Lord bless the family of the late Professor Kanyeihamba and keep them in perfect peace through this difficult season. I am your friend, Odrek Rwabwogo.